الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. All praise and thanks belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon His servant and final messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. As to follows, my dear respected brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. So inshallah ta'ala, within a few minutes, I wanted to share with you something, it's an important question that comes right towards the end of this blessed month. And as we're approaching the end of it, I wanted to answer the question with you, how should we conclude this month? How should we conclude this month? Which type of worship should we be emphasizing and stressing upon the most so that we finish this month? And if we actually look at all the types of worship that a believer is commanded and ordered to do, we find that the conclusion of every worship is very common. Whether it's for the salat, whether it's for zakat, whether it's for hajj, whether it's for fasting, whatever worship it is, the end, the conclusion, how a believer concludes a worship is all the same. And that is al-istighfar, the idea of istighfar. Now let's see this, inshallah. I'll walk it through one by one of the pillars of Islam and of these type of good deeds and actions that one does, and how does Allah Azza wa Jal teach this. So you know, An-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he lived a life of tawheed. He lived a life of la ilaha illallah. And as he is dying, just before his death, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to him a surah in the Quran, that is Surah Al-Nasr, in where he says to him, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَاسْتَغْفِرْهُ. Now that he's coming towards the end of this life of La ilaha illallah, Allah Azza wa Jal is telling him, now seek forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ask Allah for forgiveness. And you know, the first pillar in Islam is ash-shahadatayn, to bear witness and testify, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Muhammad, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Once you know La ilaha illallah, once you implement it, once you live this life, it's a worship. Obviously, living according to La ilaha illallah is the biggest worship one does. How should you conclude that worship when you come towards the end of your life? Allah says, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لِذَنْبِكَ. Seek forgiveness, ask Allah Azza wa Jalla to forgive you. This is how you conclude a life of La ilaha illallah. Look at the second pillar in Islam, as-salat. When we finish the salat, what do we say? Astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah 3 times. And then one begins to question, why is he saying La ilaha illallah? Or why is he saying astaghfirullah? Is it because of a sin he's committed? No, usually what people know is that astaghfirullah is something that's said when one commits a sin, one does something bad. Someone backbites someone, you say to him, brother, astaghfirullah. But you've just finished a great act, you've prayed, this good deed, this good action, and right after it, you're saying, and everyone is saying astaghfirullah, not once, 3 times. So now it begs the question, why? I'll answer it at the end. You see, the third pillar in Islam is zakat, giving zakat. Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, فَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ وَأَقْرِضُوا اللَّهَ قَرْضًا حَسَنًا وَمَا تُقَدِّمُوا لِأَنفُسِكُم مِّنْ خَيْرٍ تَجِدُوهُ عِندَ اللَّهِ وَخَيْرًا وَأَعْظَمَ أَجْرًا وَاسْتَغْفِرُوا اللَّهَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. So He said, establish the prayer and give zakat, and anything you give for Allah's sake, you'll find it later on. You'll find it much better and much more rewarding with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He said, wastaghfirullah, and ask Allah to forgive you. Meaning when you give zakat al-mal, or whatever zakat you give, say astaghfirullah after it. And if you've given it, how you conclude that worship? By saying astaghfirullah. Now skip the Ramadan, let's go to Hajj, and I'll come back to Ramadan. The Hajj, when one is in Hajj, you begin the Hajj. As you're coming towards the end of Hajj, Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, فَإِذَا قَضَيْتُمْ, He says, ثُمَّ أَفِيضُوا مِنْ حَيْثُ أَفَاضَ النَّاسِ وَاسْتَغْفِرُوا اللَّهِ. Again, He says, once you're done, or once you're finishing, He says, go with the people, flow with the people, wherever the people go, go with them. That's how you finish the Hajj. And then He says, وَاسْتَغْفِرُوا اللَّهَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. And as a final advice, once you're finishing Hajj, Allah is saying, seek the forgiveness of Allah, ask Allah to forgive you. So subhanAllah, you see that all is asking from you to seek Allah's forgiveness right towards the end of the worship. And Ramadan is no exclusion. Ramadan is no exception. The ulama, they said when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِتُكَبِّرُوا اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا هَدَاكُمْ وَلَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ. Part of وَلِتُكَبِّرُوا اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا هَدَاكُمْ, which means and to declare the perfection of Allah Azza wa Jal based on how He guided you, so that you may be thankful. They said that, because this of course it's speaking about the month of Ramadan, they said لِتُكَبِّرُوا اللَّهَ, meaning so that you ask Allah Azza wa Jal for forgiveness, so He accepts the worship and this fasting from you. So what we learn from this is that every single type of worship you do, it must be concluded with the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with you asking Allah to forgive you. Now why? Because when you do that, you're acknowledging that your worship wasn't the best. When you do that, when you ask astaghfirullah after salat, when you say astaghfirullah after zakat, when you say astaghfirullah in these last days of Ramadan, which is supposed to, that's how it's supposed to be concluded. When you say astaghfirullah at the end of Hajj, when you're saying astaghfirullah towards the end of your life, what you're actually acknowledging is that what worship and what act that just took place wasn't perfect. And so you're asking, Ya Allah, forgive me for the shortcomings that took place in the worship. When you say astaghfirullah after the worship, you humble yourself before Allah Azza wa Jal. You're saying that that wasn't my perfect, that wasn't the best. And I'm in need of your maghfirah, I'm in need of your forgiveness. Otherwise, my worship isn't going anywhere. But subhanAllah, this statement, astaghfirullah, it humbles the human being, especially it humbles the believer, that he understands Ramadan, he's been fasting, qira'atul Quran, praying day and night, and i'tikaf, and it's just going all out, and he's really getting tired. But don't be deceived and don't be fooled by that you're thinking that maybe this is it, it's enough, I've done good. At the end of it, you need to say astaghfirullah, meaning you need to acknowledge that wasn't the perfect, that wasn't perfect. That wasn't everything you could have done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so you seek forgiveness, and it's perhaps through that Allah Azza wa Jal forgives your shortcomings in the worship and He accepts you. So this is something important to understand, that we conclude the month with astighfar. Let me just finish with this. What is the best way to seek the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What is it? Option A, to say astaghfirullah, or option B, to say astaghfirullah al-azim wa atubu ilayh, or option C is to say astaghfirullah al-azim alladhi la ilaha illa huwal hayyul qayyum wa atubu ilayh, or option D, none of the above. Which one? Okay. We have something maybe no one heard you. What else? C? Second, B, what else? Okay. Or D, none of the above. None of the above. Okay, mashallah, the brother mentioned it, and there is actually, if you open Husn al-Muslim, or you open the books of dua, and it's narrated upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he taught us something called Sayyidul Istighfar. It's in his own words, he called it Sayyidul Istighfar. Meaning this is the crown of seeking forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you ask what is the best way to seek forgiveness of Allah, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam taught us that this is Sayyidul Istighfar. Nothing beats it. This is the king of all of them. And he taught it, and of course this is Allahumma anta rabbi la ilaha illa anta khalaqtani wa ana abduk wa ana ala ahdika wa wa'dika wa istata'at a'udhu bika min sharri ma sanat abu'u laka bi ni'matika alay wa abu'u bi dhanbi faghfir li fa innahu la yaghfiru dhunuba illa ant. This is a very, very deep dua. If you want to dissect this dua phrase after phrase, subhanAllah, you'll understand how deep it is, and how the more you read it, the more it makes the slave of Allah Azza wa Jal humble towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the more it makes you understand that you are in desperate need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's forgiveness, so that He accepts the worship from you. So this is the message. The last remaining days of Ramadan ended with istighfar. If it requires that you just sit down for one whole night, one whole day, or whatever it is, just astaghfirullah. If you don't know the complete version, whatever it is, open up the book, read astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. That's how you're supposed to conclude this month. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for our shortcomings. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bestow His mercy upon us and to make us people of the Quran, people who benefit from the reminders of the Quran. إنه ولي ذلك والقادر عليه وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.